Michelle Marie McGrath. Welcome to today's episode of Unclassified Woman, and today I'm delighted to share an interview with a gorgeous friend of mine, Dr. Ezzie Spencer. Ezzie is an author, speaker and coach, and her first book, An Abundant Life, Flourishing with the Cycles of the Moon, has just launched. And we're going to be talking about the topic of working with the cycles of the moon, which is actually Ezzie's concept, Lunar Abundance, which is her personal practice. This marries intellect with intuition and has reaped results for many women around the world through one-to-one coaching sessions and through the support of her flourishing online community at lunarabundance.com. Ezzie trained as a lawyer, went on to work in government, non-profit and research sectors, and earned her Ph.D. in women's well-being and justice after violence. Feeling that something elemental was missing in the intellectual world of law, Ezzie then began to explore the correlation she noticed between her feelings and the phases of the moon. So I know you're going to love this magical topic, and so let's get into it. So hi Ezzie, so great to have you here today and so excited about your new book.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me on your beautiful podcast. I'm also really excited about my book.
No, so it's brilliant. So before we get into our conversation, would you like to just give us a little brief summary about the subject?
Yeah, so the book is called An Abundant Life, Flourishing with the Cycles of the Moon. And so it is a step-by-step guide to working with the moon cycle to be able to create, your best version of your life. And it is really practical. So it breaks down the moon cycle into the 8 main moon phases that I work with in the Lunar Abundance practice, which is really where the book content and subject matter has sprung from. Is a personal practice called Lunar Abundance, which I developed about 10 years ago, and I've worked with a lot of women around the world now with this practice. And the book is really designed to be a practical guide to working with each one of those 8 moon phases throughout the moon cycle in order to bring our, that dream life that many of us sort of have, or maybe we don't even give ourselves permission to really dream big. So that's the first step is to dream big, and then give the practical steps and strategies to bring that into form in sync with the moon.
One of the things that I really enjoyed when I was starting to read the book was where, you mention about different sort of cultures and their relationship with the moon and, which I think is fascinating. And so was there anything that you discovered whilst doing your research that really surprised you? Any really weird or bizarre things that you discovered in terms of, different cultures' beliefs about the moon?
Well, I think one thing that really stood out for me when I was doing that cultural research was around how so many cultures in their belief systems or in their religious systems, their creation myths, obviously have the moon feature strongly and centrally, and there's no surprises there because, of course, for millennia, humans have gone outside at night and looked up at the moon and sort of wondered about what our relationship is with it. And, it's that gateway through to imagining something so much bigger than ourselves. So of course it features in different cultural mythologies. But it often does seem to be personified, as a god or a goddess. But that was the interesting thing really, is that oftentimes we think about the moon as feminine. Yeah. And indeed it is a goddess in many cultures, but in other cultures it might actually be a god. So there is though often this polarity between the moon and the sun. So oftentimes, there will be for example, the Incas had, the moon goddess, Mama Killa, and a sun god. inter, but then, there might be, for instance, in the Australian Aboriginal Warlpiri tradition, the sun woman and the moon man. So there does seem to be this kind of polarity that does play out with these different sort of, masculine, feminine, God, goddess, whichever sort of, way it falls. And I feel like that's so, fascinating for us as we work, particularly in the Lunar Abundance practice. We work with the yin and the yang, which is just another expression, I think, of these different polarities, these different energies that we have in life, and that we tend to, have this real sizzle when we have these different, energies and polarities working with each other and coming together. And that's played out around the world over time.
Yeah, and so also with the yin and the yang, that also connects into different phases of the moon, doesn't it? And it seems to go like with the cycle, when we follow those different stages, it seems to go from like, yin yang, and it goes between the two. And so do you have, in relation to that, do you have a favorite phase of the moon? And if so, like what is it about it that you really love?
Well, it's so interesting because I really feel like when I first started working with this practice, it was a practice which I needed to create for myself, because I needed a better way of being in the world. I was really living in a very sort of hustle, push, go mode all the time. So that would be more like what I'd call the yang mode, yang mode of operating, the doing. And so I would find that those yin phases would be really welcome and really favorite phases throughout the month, although they have their own sets of challenges, and I can go into that. But, that have that permission to really slow down and to give myself a little bit of a break and to rest and restore is really it was really beautiful for me as I started to work with the practice. And the yang and the yin phases come in pairs. So one moon phase will be yang, and the next will be yin, and the next will be yang and yin, and so forth throughout the month. They last 3 or 4 days each. So it's a really beautiful rhythm to work with in the practice. And for someone who used to just push myself to the extremes and to the brink of burnout, to have these opportunities just to take the foot off the gas, definitely has been, it's beautiful. Definitely. I think all the yin phases are good.
Yeah. And so have you noticed, like in working with so many women through this, have you noticed, like, is there a particular time that people struggle with the most? Because I know that obviously it's easy for us to all get excited about setting intentions at the new moon. And then also when we have the full moon, that's something that people love because it's just so dramatic and it's so visible and people can feel the impact of that a lot. But as we know, they're only 2 elements.
I would say that the number one phase which women tend to struggle with in the practice is the gibbous moon phase, which is the 4th moon phase. And that's the moon phase that directly precedes the full moon. So the gibbous moon phase is the few days before the full moon. And I think there's a couple of reasons why women find that phase to be difficult. One is, as you mentioned, the full moon is this really dramatic, climactic point in the cycle. And when we work, when I'm working with the moon phases and the moon cycle, I'm working with it symbolically. I'm looking at patterns, working with the moon as a mirror for, as above, so below. What's going up in the sky often tends to reflect what's happening for us down below here on Earth. That principle of correspondence is key to the practice. And so, if we're thinking about, climax in that term, in those kind of terms, think about how many times in life that we do try to just race to the end. We try to fast track, we try to get there, we try to achieve. If we're in the bedroom, we might try to race to orgasm, even, in the literal kind of or palpable representation of that. And so in the sense of the moon cycle, there can be this sense of impatience at the gibbous moon phase. There can be this sense of mounting intensity, and we often don't really know what to do with that. And so
Yes.
that can manifest through becoming, kind of frustrated or becoming irritable if we're not in a deep and healthy relationship with our emotional selves. And the moon represents the emotions. So I think, this is a very familiar experience with women who start to work with the moon cycle. It's like when we start to come into, start to pay attention to our emotions that we've been suppressing for so long, we can, when we start to thaw out and when we stop disassociating, we start to pay attention to what's actually going on for us. It can be really confronting as we learn to be able to be with ourselves, whatever is going on for us. And so at no other time in the moon cycle is perhaps that more powerful than in the moon phase, in the few days before the full moon. So the invitation at that phase is to trust. That's the abundance principle that we work with in the Lunar Abundance practice, is to trust at that gibbous moon phase. And that is easiest done.
And I suppose that would be a time when people can make quite irrational decisions, or, those knee-jerk reactions to things, like where you go completely bonkers about just a tiny little thing that sort of triggers you. And then afterwards you might think, oh my goodness, like what was that all about,
Yeah, and so there is that invitation to be like to really continue to cultivate sensitivity, because I think our sensitivity, of course, as we've discussed this in the past, Michelle, our sensitivity is superpower, but it doesn't need to be as it doesn't need to be highly reactive. You can be sensitive and stable and really able to stay anchored in your own experience, but it does take practice.
Yeah.
And it is so important to stay embodied and grounded through the practice. Definitely part of what I cultivate through Lunar Abundance is that sense of physical embodiment through focusing on the body, through focusing on the physical sensations in the body, and continuing to anchor into that, continue to anchor into the body to stay centered and grounded and be with whatever is.
So awareness is really the key, isn't it, with that, especially if we know that part of the cycle's coming up where we might feel overly sensitive, then it's about cultivating practices that really assist us through that transitory, phase that might be very intense.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing practice. It's one of those things where this is a daily practice, really, and the more that you do practice this over time, the practice will have cumulative effects. So you're not as knocked around in those periods of greater intensity when you've been doing the work just on a daily basis, or and it doesn't need to be overwhelming. It doesn't need to be a huge amount of work, but just doing that consistent practice over time can render really great results.
Yeah, and with this, I find it really fascinating when, so many people would completely discount the power of the moon. It does control the tides. And, so how can it have no impact on us whatsoever if it's controlling elements and linking in with the different elements and cycles in that way? So do you feel that this is just another example of how disconnected we've become from the cycles of nature in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it's one of the most interesting things that I find, that it's almost like there's a cognitive dissonance between those who might be, say, skeptical or cynical about the moon's effects. And I always say, by all means, just witness it for yourself, just pay attention. But I find that whenever I'm interacting with anyone who's in the service, in the service sector, anyone who's working, say, in the criminal justice system, anyone who's working in the education system, even people who are working on like a customer support or a complaint desk, everyone anecdotally will say, my goodness, I have this huge, uptick in calls forth around the full moon. And, to the point where, I once had my apartment burgled on the full moon. And so these big burly police officers turned up at my, front door, to respond to my my call for help. And they were like, oh yeah, of course. Well, it's the full moon, so of course this happens. This happens all the time at the full moon. So, you're hearing this like anecdotally all the time, even from people that you wouldn't expect. You're hearing this all the time, from people who are sort of tuned into the experience of, working with the moon. I suppose it's a very, very interesting question. But some of the research around it, or I guess almost like the lack of research around this and why the moon has the effect that it does, was another really interesting finding, I guess, from the work that I put together the book, because I find, the scientific community does seem, for the most part, interested in just debunking the full moon myth. And I think certainly, I'm a big one for evidence.
Yeah.
But I feel like, given just the relationship between what the moon represents, and is even embedded in the English language.
Yeah.
We talk about lunacy.
And
as
lunatics and
lunar. So it's so embedded in our lives, in our language, anecdotally, that I find it really interesting then that the little pieces here and there of the patchy scientific evidence seems to be set out to try to debunk the myth. And there is some, there are some studies that have been done that do show, for instance, that humans sleep less under a full moon.
Definitely.
And there are studies that show that there are, sort of upticks in activities, for instance, in the mental health system.
Yeah.
In Australia, there have been studies around that as well with the moon, but then there's also all these countervailing studies that show, that there's no correlation, whatsoever. But then you can get into a whole lot of minutiae around the details of how are you defining the full moon phase and so on and so forth. And there's actually a really interesting, book or comment I came across in a book by a man called Ernest Naylor, who wrote about lunar cycles. And he actually said that in the scientific community, because the moon is considered to be associated with irrationality, and that it and indeed with the feminine, so this is a whole other conversation that we could be having, at least in the West or the global West. Oftentimes the moon does tend to be associated with the feminine. Even though, of course, that's not the case, across the board, across all time. But, I think that there are some really interesting reasons why perhaps there haven't been the studies into why the moon has the effect that it does. And this particular professor was saying that it was actually, it really can sound the death knell on a respectable scientific career to do lunar research. And so I just find that to be absolutely fascinating. And indeed it can be, I think, as you look further and further into it and the range of different theories around what is the moon's effect and why does the moon have any kind of effect, it becomes very mysterious and murky, which in and of itself is probably very much in theme with the moon.
Yeah, and one of the things that I noticed when, thinking about this, when reading your book as well, is how, I remember there was a comment about the original meaning according to the Greek triple moon goddess. So can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. So this is actually from some research by Demetra George, which I talk about in the book. And she actually, she's done a lot of research into ancient Greek mythology, and Hecate was a very powerful goddess, and she was, I suppose she was she was one of the very senior priestesses or patron of priestesses or patron of witches in ancient Greece, and she represented wealth and magical powers, and she was one of the moon goddesses in ancient Greece. She was a triple moon goddess, and so she was responsible to really bestowing this lunacy, this this concept of being able to connect with the other realms, this was a very beneficial thing to have bestowed upon you. You were lucky if Hecate chose to bestow this upon you in order to facilitate vision, prophetic insight, and magical powers. So lunacy was something which at one stage was certainly revered and sort of this special thing that you would get. And then it's interesting to see the way that the meaning of that word has changed over time. And I'm not sure exactly what the translation was between the Greek and the Latin and the English and so forth. But, this concept of being able to connect with the other realms taking on certainly like a pejorative meaning as it has in more modern times, I think is also indicative of the way that we've tended to devalue or dismiss the moon and the impact that it has.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It really is. But I mean, obviously, it's great that we're starting to reconnect more with these natural cycles and also connect more with our own sort of innate nature. And so, with that, have you found in working with women that start to really work through the Lunar Abundance practice that they then also become more in touch with their menstrual cycle, for example?
Yeah, I mean, this is something which I hear a lot from women. I would say it's probably one of the things that women are most interested in with the moon work, or a lot of women tend to come to working with the moon because they've heard it can actually assist with some menstrual issues. And so, I think I would sort of say this with the caveat of it being, if there are any real sort of medical issues that someone is having, then should still seek professional help. But something that I do hear over and over is that women, for instance, who haven't bled for a long time, depending on, on their age, can actually start to get their menstrual cycle again once, start bleeding again once working proactively with the moon cycle. So that's something which I hear over and over again from women in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s, that they may start to bleed again after an extended period of not bleeding just by tracking the moon and setting intentions with the new moon. Those tend to be the kind of activities which women do. And then I can't tell you the number of times I've got phone calls and emails and messages saying that women have started to bleed again. So I don't know exactly why that is. I think there are some real correlations between the moon in the sky and women's menstrual cycle.
Totally.
They're roughly the same period of time. So that seems to be an obvious reason why. The other thing is that particularly with the Lunar Abundance practice, I'm not working with the moon and sort of saying the moon is making us do anything. I'm working with the moon as a mirror, like I said before. And so the invitation when working with the moon is to work with the moon as a trigger to come within and to enhance that body awareness. And I think that when we do come into our bodies and we're paying attention to our bodies and our cycles and our rhythms, of which the menstrual cycle is only one cycle, but when we do start to grow that greater awareness, then I think it does make sense that things might start to flow, which if, perhaps there hadn't been, if there hadn't been sort of serious medical issues, that might have something to do with it.
Absolutely. And obviously in that you refer to the moon repeatedly as a natural timekeeper. So that makes complete sense. So now, how would you approach deadlines when you feel that the current moon phase is completely counterproductive to what needs to be accomplished? Because I was just thinking about this and thinking, like, imagine, for women who are in really busy roles, they've not got much flexibility, they're trying to juggle their family and other responsibilities. I mean, imagine having to finalize a project and then saying to their boss, look, I can't really focus on this the next few days. Like, we're in a yin phase. It's just, I'm going to feel like I'm pushing shit uphill, for example. So, I mean, these are real, conundrum situations. So what's the best approach for that when you know that there are things that you literally have to do? You can't just kind of rest and wait. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And so I think it's a couple of things I want to speak to there. And the first is that understanding, the yin and the yang and how they work together. And so if we're, and this really draws on the principles from Taoism, and many of us are familiar with the classic yin yang symbol, which of course has the sort of the white curving around the sort of the white sort of teardrop, sort of slightly on an angle, curving around the black teardrop on the other side, creating a circle. And the idea is for balance and harmony. And so, of course, in the white, in that little diagram, and I hope we're all visualizing it, in the white teardrop, there's actually a black dot, and in the black teardrop, there's a white drop. And so there's always going to be a little bit of yang and yin, and there's always going to be a bit of yin and yang. It's about the polarity, and it's always these two modes of operating, as I refer to them in Lunar Abundance, are always going to be existing relative to each other. And so yang phase, the doing, action-oriented phase, is always going to be existing relative to the yin phase, which is a more restorative phase. However, a yin phase doesn't mean just lying in bed, and the yang phase doesn't mean being out in the world, being a complete drill sergeant. It's about working with these two principles in tandem and harmony, so like moving forwards and then pulling back. And so, for instance, what that would look like in the context that you've just described, just being in a working environment and, a big report lands on your desk and you've got a deadline and you've got to get it done, of course, it's a yin phase, of course, we're living in the real world or the modern world, I should say, and it doesn't all revolve around the moon. But the principle of, being able to be gentle on yourself and in some parts and sometimes in some parts of your week, and then, being in a position to then restore, and so you have the enough energy to keep going at other times applies. So, for instance, maybe you need to prioritize work in that day, and maybe you don't then go to the spin class after work that day, and maybe you don't then go out to the pub and stay out with your friends, or maybe you don't really push yourself, to go above and beyond, for that family member that night, because you have to get that particular report done and that's a priority for you. But, how can you be kind to yourself in other parts of your life at that time so that you don't burn yourself out? Because the reality is that if you do just keep pushing and pushing and pushing, regardless if it's a yang phase or a yin phase, the laws of nature say that you are eventually going to get exhausted. You're going to burn yourself out, you'll get sick, or you won't be able to, you'd be able to produce your best work anyway, and you won't be able to be there for the people in your life that need you, and you won't be able to take care and nourish your body. So I guess another thing as well, though, is which is also important, is that if you do have a lot of responsibilities at any one time and you still get that report landing on your desk and you still have the deadline to meet, the other aspect of yin phases, which I speak about in the Lunar Abundance practice, is very much about the process. So it's not about really driving yourself to be an ultra perfectionist and ticking all the boxes and putting in 110% all the time, because not only are you just going to run out of energy, or you're only going to be able to have some energy in some parts of your life if that is your mode of operating all the time. But, where are the situations where, for instance, you can really get that report done by putting in a little bit less effort. Like, what could actually go out of the report writing process, for instance? Like, do you really need to put in all those extra sections, or is it a matter of saying, okay, I just need to put my inner perfectionist to bed at this point and to realize that I can actually put in, or my process through, trying to meet this deadline is not to stress myself out, not to, really try to go above and beyond, but to see in this situation, given I have all these other things happening in my life and all this other work, and I still need to meet this deadline, what is the minimum that I can do in order to get this to a place where I'm going to be, happy to submit it to my boss, and my boss is going to be happy because it's going to do the job.
Yes. So it's about discernment, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And knowing that, you don't always need to go above and beyond. You don't always need to put in 110%. And certainly I tend to work mostly with women who need to unwind that perfectionist or overachieving way of operating.
Yes.
And so, and this is because, this is the category that I was in, and I developed this as a personal practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that leads us on to, I found it quite interesting that the way that you were talking about like non-negotiable principles in values and working with those during the moon cycle. So can you share a little bit with us about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is, I think, picking up on that point of discernment. It's like, well, how do you know what to discern? How do you know what to leave out, or how do you know where to put your effort in your life? And so rather than just be really, tossed around by the winds of life and the whims of others, like so many of us live our entire lives based on what other people would like us to do, other people's expectations of us. And sometimes those expectations are, voiced and communicated in words and verbally, and sometimes not. But when we're very sensitive and empathic, we can pick it up and still act accordingly. There is very much in Lunar Abundance this sense of being able to create your own life and to be able to make choices within the context of, the cards that you've been dealt in this lifetime. So to find those pockets of agency that you have, to be able to be very intentional about how it is that you live your life, and to really start with the big picture, like what life would you like to lead, really zooming out and allowing yourself to dream big. And then from that place, getting very clear about, well, what are your priorities, and your current actions, your current behaviors, your current values. If you're looking at your life right now, what are the gaps between where you currently are right now and where you'd like to be? And, are your current priorities in your life being set by you, or being set just by the world around you and by the people around you? Is it just the de facto way that you're living your life without really sitting down and getting very clear on those priorities? And so just having that, giving yourself that permission to be very clear on what your priorities are, working out, well, what are your non-negotiables? Is it work? In which case, to come back to that previous example, if your career right now is your top priority, and if it's, progressing in your career is a absolute, top non-negotiable for you, then yeah, you stay back at work and you get that report done. But if indeed you have other priorities, if you have other non-negotiables in your life that include health and well-being, or might include relationships, and include a whole range of other things that most of us have in our lives at any given time, but these all shift and change and evolve at different stages of life as well.
Yeah.
It's really only you who can be setting out what are your priorities, and just getting very clear through that priority setting exercise. And I include this in the book. There's a chapter on this, getting clear on your priorities and setting your non-negotiables, and then really designing your life around those non-negotiables so that you're living in integrity with what you have identified is important for you, and you're honoring yourself in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Through this practice and working consciously with the ability to experience more abundance, and of course, abundance can be determined so differently by every single person. It means different things to different people. You know, it's not just about finances, which is often what people associate that word with immediately. It can be an abundance of all good things. But one of the blocks that I guess can come up very often for women who are, you know, by nature very giving, is the challenge can be in learning to receive, especially when we're so conditioned to be giving. So is there a part of the cycle that addresses receiving specifically? And you know, what advice would you give to someone who is really still challenged with learning to receive and what that means?
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter in the book on receiving, and it is correlated in the lunar abundance practice with the sixth of the 8 lunar phases. So the disseminating moon phase, the phase after the full moon, after the moon starts to wane back down from full to the darkness of the new moon again. And of course, you know, the cycle starts at the new moon in darkness, waxes up to the full moon, and then wanes back down to the new moon. So the disseminating moon phase is really the point in the cycle at which some of the, you know, if you've been setting an intention and working with that intention through following the abundance principles in the earlier parts of the cycle, that you'll really start to receive results. You know, you start to receive your moon goodies at that disseminating moon phase if you haven't already earlier in the cycle. If you're working with an abundance intention, which I encourage women to do at the new moon phase, is to set that abundance intention and then work throughout the entire cycle. And so there's a bunch of exercises that I include in that chapter around receiving and becoming aware, first of all, because you said before, Michelle, like, this is an awareness practice.
Yeah.
So, you know, but the very first step is awareness and becoming aware of what your receiving patterns actually are. And so many of us don't realize that knee-jerk response we might actually have if someone, for instance, you know, gives us a compliment, like says that we look nice today. You know, this knee-jerk response can often be, oh, this old thing, you know,
Exactly.
I just got this dress from the op shop. Like, oh, no, I don't, or you're just being kind. We can be really self-deprecating, and we may not even catch ourselves speaking in that way about ourselves unless there is that invitation to really pay attention. And so that is that focal point for that phase, is to pay attention. What do you say when someone says, you know, your hair's looking lovely today, or, you know, that's a really good comment or really useful, you know, remark that you just made, or even something more tangible like, can I buy you a coffee? You know, do you go scrabbling around in your purse to say, no, wait, let me reimburse you? Or then do you try to go above and beyond and then go out and buy them lunch, for instance?
Yes,
you know,
to overcompensate.
Overcompensate, you know, and that would be a great example of if your receiving patterns are a little bit out of whack. And I do run through a lot of other examples in the book as well. And so, you know, that can be the first step, is awareness around, and to know that, I mean, the examples I've given are just so, you know, so small.
But so common though, so common and so ingrained.
And so indicative of where there may be bigger resistance.
Yeah.
And so anywhere in life, I mean, I work with patterns, as I've said before, and that's why I'm so entranced, I think, by the moon, because it's such an observable, trackable cycle and pattern, and you can see these patterns and rhythms within ourselves emerge over time so obviously, so palpably when you work with the moon. But in the you know, when we are looking at these, say, really small, innocuous and commonplace patterns around receiving, they're often played out. You know, if there's a pattern in one part of your life, it's probably appearing in other parts of your life as well.
Yeah.
And so if you take care of it, this is a practice. So, you know, very safe and gentle practice, the lunar abundance practice. So if you take care of that in these very small, innocuous ways, then actually you're doing a much deeper healing in other parts of your life as well. And it's not like you're trying to transform or tackle the big, beast, overnight, but it's about really making these low risk, small scenarios a very safe place, a very safe playground for you to practice receiving. And so if you're someone who finds it difficult to, accept the compliment, next time someone says that you look lovely today, and believe me, this will happen. It'll happen right away once you start to pay attention.
Of course.
Someone is going to say that you look lovely, and so the way to work with that is just to bite your lip if you start to, or watch yourself when you start to come out with the, oh God, you're just being nice, or indeed if you just need to mirror back, oh, you look lovely,
Yeah.
Allow yourself a moment to say thank you and to actually receive it.
Yeah.
And to receive that compliment or that coffee or whatever it is. It could be something much bigger than that, of course. But allow yourself to actually receive it with gratitude and to feel grateful for the fact that this other person has shown up as an expression of the universe, just, wanting to give to you and to give you an opportunity to practice receiving.
Yeah, so true. And, one that I know I've used this a lot over the years is often people will say, oh, that's a lovely top, or, they're nice pants. Oh, I've had these for years, or, oh, it was only $20, or, just this kind of dismissing almost, because we can feel uncomfortable with that. So it's such a powerful practice to start, as you say, just noticing it with little comments and things like that about how we rebuff it and we don't open to receive it.
And that if we are able to receive those small things, if we're able to receive that that's a nice top compliment, then actually we're opening the doorway to receiving so much more.
Absolutely. And now, one of the things that I'm really looking forward to listening to is the audios that you've created that go with your book about how you wrote the book, working with the cycles of the moon. And I know that you also did this when you wrote your Ph.D, which is, I found that fascinating when we were talking about that some time ago, and you were saying like how you managed to write that in a relatively short space of time in comparison to, some people who may take years to complete that, but because you were working very consciously with those cycles. So it really can help people with their projects, their creative expression, their productivity levels, can't it? Absolutely.
100%. And it's really interesting when we do look at, again, these yin cycles. And the yin cycles are key to being, I feel, highly productive, highly effective, but doing it in a way where you're really able to take care of yourself. So, you're really feeling that sense of health and vitality within yourself. And you can have an easeful process. Like these processes, where we're working on these big projects, whether they're a book, a PhD, or, a big work project, whatever it is, it can actually be enjoyable. And so many of us have this conditioning that we need to be working really hard, in the sense that we need to be striving and hustling all the time. But actually, in order to be productive, but actually I found in my own life and my own work and my own business and my own, doctoral studies, is that it's not like that at all. You can have really great outcomes by leaning into these more counterintuitive practices of allowing yourself the space to rest and restore and actually open up to even greater inspiration and creativity as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true, isn't it? That often that space of just being and not doing, even if we sometimes have like a quiet half hour where we're off the internet and we're just sort of pottering around, bam, often that's when you suddenly have all these great ideas, or you're in the shower, or, whatever it is, when you've just switched off and you're not trying to make something happen. So it's so true. It's so, yeah, again, it sort of seems really obvious, but it's great to have these practices like the Lunar Abundance practice where we can, have these sort of reminders daily of connecting to these natural cycles. And so what would you say, Ezzie, has been the greatest gift that you've received in practicing lunar abundance?
Well, I feel like this sense of relaxing and being able to enjoy life a little bit more has been just central to my life now and versus my life before this practice. And I don't want to give the sense that I was, really in crisis before I started this practice, because that wouldn't be accurate. But I knew inside myself that I was missing something, and that's why I created this. And it's certainly been a practice which has been so nourishing and so gentle and so supportive, and yet has actually radically transformed my life to the point I am able to, live in a way where I wouldn't even imagine that the way that am currently living and working would have been possible for 10 years ago. It was so outside of my frame of reference that I could be doing work that I loved and be working, with women around the world and, really affecting change in people's lives and being able to have these expanding circles and just this expanding sense of opportunity to be making money whilst being able to be creative and to be, hopefully contributing something to the world. Yeah.
Well, you certainly are contributing something, and it will be really exciting to hear when you start getting a lot of feedback from people reading the book about how they've become more aware of their habits and the changes that they've made. So that's going to be really exciting.
I am really looking forward to hearing that. I love to hear from from people who work with the practice. It's a living, breathing practice, and people are very welcome to connect with me on social media, and Instagram's my favorite.
Yes.
And to come and play and share with me how this is really working in your life.
Well, thank you. It's been so great to speak to you today. And I know that people can follow along with you on Instagram with the visuals as well, with the different phases of the moon at your Instagram, which is Lunar Abundance, isn't it?
That's right. So Lunar spelled Lunar, Abundance is my Instagram handle. And then my website is lunarabundance.com. And I've got some free downloads there, like the free lunar planner, which has all of the dates for the 8 moon phases for both the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and other things, other tracking and journaling.
And all the details about joining the Lunar Abundance Salon for people that really want to follow that process along with a group of other women around the world who are really working through that as well.
Plenty of good stuff there.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, Ezzie. It's been so great.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle. It's been a delight.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Unclassified Woman. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. For information on events and services, connect with Michelle at michellemariemcgrath.com.